And of course, one of the things that Marx is great at is actually identifying the internal contradictions of a capitalist society, why it cannot meet the needs of the mass of the people, in spite of having a theory which said it would. And similarly, in terms of the politics of the thing, that the state apparatus, which should be working for the people, was in fact generally going to be corrupted. And behind that lies the idea that the ruling class has some ruling ideas, and it does a pretty good job, with the help of a bunch of academics, of course, propagating those ruling ideas in such a way that they support corporations and support the existing system rather than critique it. So Marx has a critique of all of that. And I think it was incredibly helpful to me to start to read Marx many years ago now, but I didn't start reading it till I was 35 years old.
Oh, good. We're in good company.
Yeah, right. No, there's a good chance for all of you. Yeah, I think this is very important. And I was self-taught. And one of the things that I'm very, very impressed by historically is the role of the self-taught person, the autodidact. And that was who Marx was talking to. Because if you're self-taught and you have no kind of ideology rammed down your throat, then you start to see the world in a different kind of way. And there are still a lot of self-taught people around and self-teaching people around. And I guess part of my work has been trying to help people self-teach themselves about Marx if they can.
Well, I love that, because I was very much doing a jog around DC yesterday, listening to your podcast series, trying to do what exactly that, learning what I, for some reason, managed to not learn in college.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So you mentioned some of these contradictions, inherent contradictions to capitalism. I wonder if you might talk us through some of those and try, if you can, to provide some examples in what's going on today. Because I think that part of what happens when people say Marx, there's a section of the population that checks out. Part of them because they've been right-wing indoctrinated and they just think that Marx is synonymous with Satan. Part of them because it just feels inaccessible and ancient and somehow irrelevant to their lives. So what does Marx teach us about what's going on right now at this crisis point?
Well, I actually have, through reading Marx, one of the things he kind of says is that knowledge at any particular moment is guided by the issues of the moment. So that the issues that were paramount with Marx back in the sort of 1850s, 1860s are not the same as the issues which are today. So if you like, the primary contradictions that he was working with are rather different from the primary contradictions that I'm working with. Now, one of my primary contradictions is that capital is always about growth. You always have to grow. And historically, capital has grown at about 3% a year since its founding. Now, 3% compound growth, when Marx was working, was not an issue. I mean, capital was only really established in Britain, part of Western Europe, and the eastern seaboard of the United States. The whole world was open. Now you're talking about a 3% rate of growth, compounding on everything that's going on in China, everything going on in India, everything that's going on in Latin America, and of course in the United States and Europe. And 3% compound growth from now on is creating all kinds of problems because the mass of the product and the mass of the capital is now absolutely huge. It's doubling every 25 years. And doubling the size of the economy means tremendous problems of absorbing this surplus which is being produced. And the absorption of it, of course, is putting immense pressure on the environment. So the idea that you can somehow or other keep 3% compound rate of growth going at the same time as you can solve all the environmental issues like climate change and all the rest of it, it's a nonsense. You can't do it. So this is a real significant contradiction.
Is the environment, I mean, obviously we all here care and are deeply invested in stopping climate change, reversing climate change. But I wonder, even outside of that, are there just kind of economic limits to growth that are the kinds of things that even capitalists are concerned about, regardless of whether or not they're concerned about the environment?
Yeah, one of the things that interests me is that one of the ways in which you can absorb the surplus is produce things that have almost zero circulation time. Now, if you produce things that lasted 100 years, and I always use the fact that I'm still going to dinner every night with my grandmother's knives and forks. And if capital produced knives and forks that lasted 100 years, it wouldn't have a market. So it has to start producing things which are instantaneous turnover. Now, that means that there has to be a form of consumption which is instantaneous. And what we've seen over the last 30 or 40 years is an immense growth in the consumption of spectacle. Spectacle in terms of, Netflix series and all those sorts of things, and sports events and all
podcasts,
podcasts, and tourism. Give you an example of this. The last crisis of 2008, between then and the breakout of COVID, international tourism increased from 800 million units to 1.4 billion movers. In other words, tourism, which is an instantaneous kind of form of consumption, increased enormously. And cruise liners and all that kind of thing. So capital started to move into areas where the turnover time in consumption was almost zero.
That makes me think of, I listened to you in a recent interview talk about freedom and the difference between kind of negative freedoms and positive freedoms, and how Americans seemed obsessed with the concept, but only in terms of negative freedom. So they want to be able to have a gun, they want to be able to not wear a mask and do all these kinds of things, but there isn't as much of a focus on freedom from want or hunger or free time itself, which you characterize as the mark of real freedom. And so there's a part of me that says, oh yes, I'm being tricked into wanting a vacation. I'm being tricked into wanting to go to, Sicily. But also, wait, isn't that the sign that I've actually been able to break free of some of these capitalist strictures? Like, isn't that a good thing for us to have more free time, more vacation time?
Well, one of the things about Contradictions is you always find, it's like the Joni Mitchell song, where she talks about, I've looked at the clouds, both sides now. You can look at capital, both sides now. And it has produced the capacity for tremendous self-education. The capacity is there. And some people take advantage of it. But at the same time, it has done it in such a way as to take that other negative freedom, and it uses freedom to exploit people's dreams about the future, in terms of all those ads about what will happen to you and when you go down to one of these sort of tropical beaches, and it fictionalizes all of that. So you get the positive and the negative. So whenever you're talking about contradictions, you never say it's all bad. You have to say there's a potentiality here, which is very important. And I think the potentiality that comes with international tourism is very important. But on the other hand, you find many cities now, for instance, in Barcelona, there's an anti-tourist movement because tourism is wrecking the city. There's an anti-tourism movement growing up on the ecology side because ecologically it's doing tremendous damage. So something that is brilliant turns into something negative. I mean, and if you want a prime example of that in recent years, it's the internet. When the internet started up, it was seen as a tremendous device for freeing people, communicating, blah, 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 blah. And now what you've got a few platforms that are controlling everything. And so this positive, negative, and the dialectic, if you like, of this is very important.
You mentioned earlier the kind of narratives that are deployed to keep people invested in the system as it is. And, part of, I think, what's so frustrating as someone who is on the left is that a lot of the contradictions that you described, a lot of the contradictions that Marx described seem pretty apparent, especially as we move into a crisis point like this. And yet there is such an infrastructure that exists to create narratives to justify the status quo. Yeah. And, I heard you in a recent interview talking about the Powell memo, which has become a recurring theme on this show, and the concerted propaganda that has come from the right in order to shore up the kind of institutional status quo that we don't even see today because it has become such a natural part of the firmament. And you told this story about, how the propaganda to make your college no longer free, because the Rockefellers understood the power that came from the kind of having free institutions. And it free public education rather. And it reminds me of this ongoing conversation that we're having about these rights, freedoms, and privileges of college debt cancellation, free tuition, et cetera, that feel never ending. Can you talk a little bit about why it is that it seems that we can't surpass these narrative battles and that the right seems to be so much better at making the case than the left does?
Well, I think that one of the big things that I think has consumed us is very much this notion of individual liberty and freedom. And that was something that was launched big time, it seemed to me, in what I would call the neoliberal turn of the 1970s, 1980s, that people felt that they were not individually free. And therefore, there was a great deal of public support for Reaganism and Thatcherism. And I think it was mistaken support, if you want to put it that way. But nevertheless, there was a lot of popular support for that transition, and people were saying, well, welfare state is really messed up. It's individual responsibility is all that matters. Freedom of the individual carries with it these responsibilities. So you get that kind of language, which was very, very powerful and significant. And for a while it worked, and many people brought into it. You would find some of the, for instance, African Americans want to become small business owners and want to become small capitalists. Women wanted to become small capitalists, wanted to join the corporations. So liberty and freedom in that style was very, very significant in supporting the totality. But then what happened was in the 1990s, the things started to go wonky and started to get really rather bad. And by the time we get to 2000, there's a crisis, economic crisis, and then the other things that are going on globally and so on. And by 2008, the whole thing is a real mess, and now it's a total disaster. And everybody starts to recognize that this system, which purported to solve the problems of the world in the 1980s and 1990s, so that somebody like Fukuyama could write a book called The End of History. We're at the end. We've finally arrived at the totality of the bourgeois state and the bourgeois life and everything. It's great, and then you kind of look and see something like Enron going on and crash in the dot-com bubble and so on. So all of these things are going on. So that, again, history tends to move in these kinds of things where there's contradictions at a certain time which get solved, as they were by Reagan and Thatcher and Pinochet and all the rest of it. And then those solutions become the problem. So right now we've got the problem of dealing with the excessive notions and the peculiar notions of individualism and freedom in a world where you cannot have individualistic solutions to the climate change problem. There has to be a collective solution. There have to be collective solutions to the pandemic. And what we've seen in the pandemic is a large number of people refusing this collective solution and in favor of the individual one, which in itself is going to create a crisis because, we got 500,000 people died because of that. Yeah. Because of that.
It does feel like there's certain kind of scientific realities of COVID and certain kind of economic realities of COVID that have, in some minimal but meaningful ways, forced the hand of a neoliberal state to acknowledge that we have to do some things collectively. So stay-at-home orders and mask mandates and vaccine rollouts and the bailout, right? The new COVID bill, all the COVID bills. Yeah. So what is interesting is that there seems to be so much consensus around doing those kinds of things, and a lot of consensus around doing, supporting programs that are even beyond what the state is currently offering. Do you think that there is revolutionary potential with that door being opened, with the public seeing that this kind of collective way of acting is necessary, that it's useful, that it's working, that they feel it in their pocketbook? And how should the left take advantage of this moment?
Well, there was a point where, for instance, Reagan famously said, the state is not the solution, the government is the problem. Mm-hmm. We've now got to the point where people recognize that good government is actually part of the solution and should be part of the solution. And that obviously gives an angle to enter into the state apparatus towards elements of the social democratic left who will, I think, want to take advantage of that. And in a sense, there is a little bit of a rerun of the New Deal thinking coming back in, and that therefore the state is going to have to become much more regulatory and all the rest of it. And there's going to be a fight over how much regulation and so on. And that regulation will carry over to things like, Facebook and Amazon and all that. Well, there's going to be some very interesting kind of things.
Do you think it will?
I think there's going to be pressure to do it, but I think that actually those corporations are, in a sense, too big and too powerful for the state to be able to do very much with them. It'll probably nibble at the edges and try to create some regulatory framework. But I think that the left, if you like, there is a revival of the kind of social democratic left. But the social democratic left is not going to challenge the growth syndrome. It's not going to get to some of the fundamental kind of questions about how labor is actually set up these days, the disempowerment of working people. It's not going to deal with a lot of those kinds of things. So there is a kind of a room for what might be called a sort of reformist left to start to nibble away a little bit. And I'm not against that. I don't sit there saying, you're just reformist. No. I think that reform is one of the paths through which you can get to revolution, because you're talking about a long-term shift. And a long-term shift is going to take a lot of work and a lot of lifting before we get there. So I'm kind of saying, I'm glad to see some of these reforms coming through. Some big reforms are, crunch reforms are going to be there over, for example, housing, the moratorium on evictions. What's going to happen when that's lifted? We're going to see a large foreclosure going on all over the place, a bit like echoing 2008, and there's going to be a lot of discontent about that. So what happens there is going to be a big issue.
Is getting rid of this right-wing idea of individualism, is that a necessary precondition for the kind of revolutionary change you're describing?
I don't like to call it a necessary precondition, because then that makes it seem like the only thing you've really got to work on is changing people's minds, and once you've changed their minds, everything works well. People really change their minds out of experiences, which is why I think Biden is doing the right thing by saying your experience of government is going to be very different, so your attitude to government is going to be very different. That will be true also with the infrastructure program that's coming, that he's setting up. In other words, when people change their mind because they get different experiences. Let's face it, the experience of the welfare state in the 1970s was rather bad. So when people challenged the welfare state, and the left was challenging the welfare state at the end of the 1960s, and saying this was a form of oppression which was being organized through the state. So to say that we'll get back to that is not exactly where we would want to go. We would want to go to a different kind of state, different kind of notions of welfare, and set up something rather different from what existed back in the 1960s and 1970s.
Well, if people change, in part at least, because of their experiences, how do you get people to start experiencing the kind of socialist world that would actually get to the heart of the growth problem and some of these bigger contradictions and move us away from, let's say, more reformist solutions to the more serious structural movement that we want?
Well, this is one of the things I get frustrated with my own style of life right now, but being on lockdown and of the age I'm at, I'm not out there seeing what's going on the ground. And I think there's a lot of stuff going on the ground right now. I mean, about a third of the nation's children are living in poverty and have food problems. And you've got this whole kind of public food provision and meals and all that kind of thing. And it's being organized through the voluntary sector and all the rest of it. But what we're seeing in effect is a socialization of consumption by these mechanisms. And then you look at it and you say, well, that's already going on. Why don't we have a political organization that takes all that over and says, okay, this is what we're going to make as a permanent form of food provision in the country. So there are things happening. And when I say experience, I think the fact that people experience some generosity and help and sociality in these mechanisms which are going on out there, that seems to me to start to create a different sensibility in terms of not what the state is about, because Washington's Washington, it's more about creating political institutions. And I think we're seeing some of that going on by the election of radical mayors and the like, who are trying to sort of organize their cities to deal with the concrete issues on the ground. And so I have a lot of faith, if you like, that there is something going on the ground, which is already the experience of an alternative. And that can then filter through when somebody kind of says, well, a decent diet is a human right. People can kind of say, yeah, I can see that. I can see that. And therefore we ought to organize society that meets that human right.
I guess my skeptical concern would be that so much of what's going on right now is framed as crisis contingent.
Yeah.
And that even people who are operating in good faith and doing their best are still framing it as temporary in nature. So we all just went through the fight with the $15 minimum wage being the only, the part that got kicked out of the COVID relief bill happened to be the only permanent structural part. You have Cedric Richmond, one of Joe Biden's senior aides, in an interview recently with Mehdi Hassan on MSNBC, where Mehdi asked him, hey, why give all this money and pay for insurance through COBRA subsidies, which are just a sop to the insurance industry, when you could set up something more along the lines of a Medicare for All program that would ultimately be cheaper for the state and give more benefit to people? And Cedric Richmond, after falling all over himself in his answer, basically says, well, we're only doing this because it's COVID. He comes out and says, we're only willing to spend this money because it's short term. And so as much as I would like to think that this will radicalize some folks, and I'm sure that it will, I guess I'd like to see some of the elected officials move from some of the reformist talk and push the front edge of what the conversation is.
Yeah. I agree with that, but that's where the struggle is.
Yeah.
But one thing you shouldn't, I think, dismiss is what the sentiment is on the ground. And I don't know what it is, because I've been out of it, and I suspect you don't know what it is either. And in fact,
I know what it is.
Well, good. Tell us, because
on a future episode, well, I'll get into it. But.
Yeah, no,
Virgil, man on the street.
But a crisis, if it's prolonged enough, and that's the interesting thing, can actually have a big impact on changing minds. I mean, I came to political consciousness, believe it or not, in World War II in Britain. And in World War II, everybody around this part of the world now will say, oh, it was all about Winston Churchill and what a great person he was. Well, my grandmother used to rail on about that bugger Winston Churchill, enemy of the working classes, and after the war was over, they were going to kick him out and they were going to create a Labour government that was going to give us universal health care. And it happened. It happened, And a lot of it came out of a shift in people's experience. I mean, people who've been sort of evacuated from the East End of London and saw that they had whole families with only one pair of shoes between all of the kids. They saw those kinds of things and said, this isn't the society we're fighting for. We're fighting for something different. And after World War II, along came a Labour government, nationalized a lot of things, gave us a universal healthcare system, gave us a lot of other things. Well, there were a lot of problems with what the Labour Party did at that time, but it was partly that change of mentality which was achieved through the collective effort of World War II, which had to be collective, had to be collectivized. And so we've seen some of that collective kind of sensibility beginning to emerge around COVID. Now, the problem is maybe the COVID thing will be over too quickly. If it lasted for 4 or 5 years, then people will be going, oh, okay, now we've really got to change the whole world and society. As it is right now, in 10 years' time, if people look at the stock market trajectory, they'll see a little blip around March of 2020, and they say, that was COVID, In other words, it was just an epiphenomenon. Yeah, and I think that the Biden administration and all the thinkers down there hope it is an epiphenomenon, and therefore no radical change is going to occur. Our job is to kind of say we've got to talk about the radical changes which are possible and which are could potentially be in the works, because some of these things are happening on the ground.
So we're in the middle of a little bit of a spicy moment on the left. That's really foregrounding some of these questions about what's too reformist, what's ultra-leftist, where should we be pushing, who should we be holding accountable. That's really centered around the fact that for the first time in American history, we have an unprecedented number of socialists, self-described democratic socialists, elected to Congress. And the question has become, to what extent should they be willing to risk it all? And what that all is like largely unclear and often overstated, but basically attract a degree of political ire to stand for more than what is kind of currently on the table because of COVID. So should they have withheld their vote for the COVID bill over $15 minimum wage? Should we now be talking about a $24 minimum wage? Should they be talking not just about student debt cancellation, but more broadly critiquing capitalism, if they're going to be called democratic socialists, and talking about the fact that this growth rate is unsustainable and that capitalism is incompatible with environmental sustenance? Do you think that it's fair for folks to be wanting to push harder right now?
Yeah, no, and I'm glad some people are. But one of the things that has always bothered me about U.S. politics, very distinctively U.S., is it's very often situated in relationship to some sense of moral purity. That you have to be a good person, and the only position a good person can take is this or this or this. And I think that what we need right now is a movement, a political movement. And a political movement, there are going to be a lot of compromises and all the rest of it. And I'm glad that we start to see these people getting elected, because it says there is a bit of a political movement out there. In the same way that somebody like Stacey Abrams can, by politically organizing, can do what she did in Georgia. This is the kind of effective political movement activities that seem to me to be crucial. So that, yes, it's good that all these things are out there and being debated, and we can discuss reformism versus revolution till the early hours of the morning and God knows what. But I think that the biggest thing right now is let's get together and create this movement, which is going to be a movement of people around the idea that the decommodification of healthcare, the decommodification of education, the decommodification of housing, and the decommodification of basic food supply, those are the crucial issues that we should be pursuing.
Are we having a movement about the decommodification of healthcare, though? If it seems, and I don't just mean seems, people who have been vanguards of this left movement have very openly stated that because Joe Biden is president, that there's just going to be no movement on that issue. And we can talk about it on a 20-year timeline, but today we're not going to agitate for Medicare for all because Joe Biden is someone who has said he would veto it even if it did pass the House and the Senate. I think that's kind of the tension, that yes, there is some unnecessary, flailing around and attacking about litmus tests that seem artificial and very personality based. I could not agree with you more there. But there's also this bigger question of what is the umbrella under which this movement is going to operate? What are the operative principles? And there are some who are, let's say, more ultra left, who I think have a reasonable claim to say that why are you calling yourself a democratic socialist if you aren't willing to articulate the critique of capitalism? If you're still saying you can be a capitalist and democratic socialist at the same time. And at the same time, there are people who are like, okay, we know we need to do some more work to get the people to a place where they can want to get on board. And you're not going to necessarily do that by striding out in the streets with, a little red book or what have you. I mean, I think that an interesting it's a difficult conversation we're having right now about how we characterize this movement so that it has the maximum effect while not overly limiting its appeal. And I wonder if there's any kind of historical examples that we should be looking to, or that could inform this kind of decision-making process.
Well, I think, I mean, the sort of the history of the socialist parties in different parts of the world and the pressures they set up are all there. The problem is that right now we have an economy that is so structured and so powerful that it's very, very difficult to find a kind of a capacity for a really revolutionary transformation. And I'm kind of going on, I've been severely criticized for saying things like, well, you know, contemporary capitalism is too big to fail. But if the thing failed, we wouldn't be having this conversation. I wouldn't have computers, and we wouldn't have this. You know, I mean, we're not in a position to say let's crash the whole system and then rebuild it from the. No, we can't do that. Mm-hmm. We'll all starve in the process. So my view is to kind of say, look, we have to be about this question of what do we do about, you know, very, very practical things like, you know, who's going to make the computers in a revolutionary age? How is computer technologies and platforms going to be organized? I mean, there's a lot of questions of that kind. Now, I have no illusions about, you know, Joe Biden and the Democrats and what they're going to do. I mean, they're a pro-capitalist organization, a pro-capitalist party. And therefore, I can't expect them to be sort of sign on to my anti-capitalist thinking. So that I would say there's two things here. One is the whole question of political education. And the second is going to be the question of really trying to find, as I mentioned earlier, those transformative things happening on the ground, which people can experience, and by the experience of them, can start collectively to organize around a different kind of political agenda, which is going to be anti-capitalist, particularly in those areas I already mentioned, like saying, well, okay, let's decommodify housing, let's decommodify education, let's decommodify healthcare, and decommodify food supply. So everybody has a decent basis for their life in those, at least on those four dimensions. And that seems to me to be, I don't know whether it's a reformist demand or a revolutionary demand. You can call it whatever you like, but it is a political demand that I think that people can understand, that all of those elements should be rights, not commodities, and access to them should not be rationed through market power.
If you are anti-capitalist, some would argue you shouldn't even be a member of the Democratic Party. And that perhaps those socialists who have managed to gain entry into the Democratic Party should at a certain point defect as a way to draw contrasts and highlight the extent to which the party itself is so often working directly against the interests of the people who elect it. And that, you know, another feature of American political system is that we don't have the advantage of a multi-party system. And do you think that there are opportunities there, or maybe even that it's a kind of a necessary move to put pressure on the Democratic Party at the very least to embrace some of these universal programs that seem like a really important starting point?
I think that's a tactical question in many ways. I would say that depends upon, you know, where the faction's at, and there may be a point where it wants to leave the party and set up on its own, or something. There may be something of that kind. It's very difficult to do in the United States. I suspect it will condemn people to irrelevance if they do that. So there was a tactical kind of question, but we can talk about that. But I really think that the question of you know, how to get this program moving should not, you know, be confined to saying, well, how can it be inserted into the Democratic Party platform at, party congresses or something of that kind. It should be on the ground, and it should be happening on the ground. And there are a lot of things occurring on the ground. And I mentioned, I have much more faith in radical mayors and radical city councils doing things which are actually, really progressive. And I have a fantasy, I can tell you this, which is that at some point or other, there's going to be a league of socialist cities. The socialist mayors all over the United States who are all coordinating with each other and say, screw Congress, we're going to do this. We're going to support each other this way. We've got surplus this and you've got surplus that. Let's have okay, I'm being utopian about this. But on the other hand, it does seem to me there are levels of political action outside of, what's happening with the Democratic Party in Congress.
Sure. Which mayors are you thinking of? Because to my knowledge, there are no, major American cities that have a socialist mayor.
Not a socialist mayor, but there's a bit of a history. For a long time, Milwaukee, for example, had a socialist mayor, which was kind of fantastic.
Well, how does Chokwe Lumumba identify in Jackson, Mississippi?
Jackson, Mississippi. I was going to say Jackson, was Jackson Rising, and so on. And I'm not going to sit here and pass judgment and say, well, that's good and that's bad. I'm kind of saying, look, we're in a situation right now where anything that moves is good. And if it's moving in the right direction, it's good. So that's why I'm not particularly interested in the reform versus revolution debate. I'm interested in just getting things moving in such a way that they're going in the right direction. And certainly certain things can happen at the municipal level. For instance, I lived for many years in the city of Baltimore, and Baltimore was one of the first cities to pass the living wage ordinance. And the living wage ordinance was done at the municipal level, and then eventually became a state thing. So, this is something that can, and we see things happening in Seattle. So there's a lot of things of that sort. And in Europe, for example, there are quite a few places that are run by, not revolutionary mayors, but by radical mayors who are trying to transform things.
I think the reason why, we've had, Kshama Sawant, Seattle City Councilwoman, socialist, on the show. And, I'm very interested and compelled by the kind of interventions that have been pursued on a local level. Her advocacy for a $15 minimum wage prestaged the national conversation and was integral to us even being where we are today in terms of that conversation. At the same time, I feel like there's a tension between understanding that, as Naomi Klein says, there's, an opportunity here to take advantage of this crisis. And a kind of a deflection to local politics. It seems like if we are going to take advantage of the crisis, it's going to have to be, in large part at least, on a national level. And I think that is why so many on the left are looking to national politics. It's not just because it's like sexy and like that's, those are people whose names we know, et cetera. It's because it does feel like we're in need of something big and structural that is necessarily national.
I can agree with that, but the trouble is at the federal level, the institutions are so set up to be so totally undemocratic that the chance of getting anything really done is very, 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 very minimal. The Senate, for example, is a situation where 20% of the U.S. population controls about 60% of the votes. And we see what that means, and then of course, there's a huge reform required to make democracy work in this country so that one person has one vote, and we see all the stuff going on around that. And for that reason, the idea that something can get through the Senate and something can go through, in a really radical way, I don't think is terribly feasible right now, which is why I'm interested in the state level. And I think taking back power at the state level, as well as at the municipal level, is very, very crucial right now. Because most of that state power is held by Republicans. They're the ones messing with so that's part of the process. And now that's going to be a long-term project. A long-term project to re-democratize the political system in the United States. That's a very long-term project. It should be there. And I think it's good to people to participate in it. But nevertheless, I think the reason I'm looking at these local initiatives and so on. It's not because I think that's where the real revolution lies or anything of that kind, or that it should only stay there, but that this one place where things can happen which are difficult to engineer at the national level.
There's this apocryphal story of A. Philip Randolph goes to FDR and lays all the concerns of labor and civil rights at his feet. And FDR says, yeah, sure, I agree with you, I guess, but you got to go out there and make me do it. And so there is this, and then obviously we got the New Deal, not because FDR was just sitting on his, in his office thinking, I'm the boss, I'm great, I'm just going to scatter coins to the masses, but because he was under a lot of pressure from a lot of left-wing movements, including the communists, et cetera, right? Yeah. And they were, in some ways, you could see it as the whole New Deal as an appeasement strategy because there were much, much bigger demands being made that the New Deal did not even begin to touch.
Right.
That doesn't feel like the place we're in now for myriad reasons. One, as many on the left have diagnosed, organized labor is much weaker than it has been historically. Yeah. And that is a longer term thing to remedy. But it also seems true that even those voices that are in a position to raise more significant demands are choosing not to do so, as I described, saying, okay, well, Joe Biden says he's not going to do this, so there's no point in asking for it. That coming from people who represent the left flank of our political discourse. Yeah. Moreover, those organized groups that do exist, and I've heard you talk about how powerful it would be if there were, for an instance, a strike of airport workers.
Right.
How the country would grind to a halt as a consequence. Those organized groups that do have the power to exert that kind of influence in the supply chain also, for whatever reason, are choosing not to do so. And I'm not saying that there aren't strategic considerations and that unions don't have obligations to their workforces, et cetera, and that labor protections are much weaker and all these other kinds of things. But what frustrates me in these conversations is that even if we diagnose that there are fewer levers of power to draw upon, there are still levers of power. It doesn't feel like, to me, there are very many people asking for accountability from those sectors that do have a degree of power still.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I think that there's a real problem there. But you're dealing with you started the social democratic movement in this country, if you want to call it that, started at a very, very low level of when basically nearly all of the forces on the left were depleted. And it had to rebuild and has been rebuilding. And I think that's a very positive thing. But there's a long way to go. There's a long way to go before somebody becomes a Democratic president of the United States, is forced to listen to the equivalent of what happened to Roosevelt. And somebody's going to say, well, unless you do this, we're going to do that. And I mean, we're not in a position to do that right now.
Well, couldn't part of the doing that be something like abandoning the Democratic Party, voting third party? It's a mutually assured destruction. Yes, I understand that the consequence might be someone very unpleasant indeed being elected. But isn't that ultimately why it's a powerful move?
I don't think it's a powerful move because you isolate yourself from all kinds of things in doing that. I mean, I understand individuals who want to do that, and I would probably do that. But I don't think politically it's something I would advise. A third party isn't gonna go very far.
Well, it's not the idea that the third party candidate will become president of the United States. It's the idea that you're withholding your vote under conditions, and that if you could deliver a constituency the same way that unions historically were able to deliver their constituents to the Democratic Party in exchange for certain promises, a third party could do the same. When we had Ralph Nader on talking about how he had a list, an agenda for Al Gore, and said, hey, if you take 3 out of the 10 or 20 things on this list and incorporate them into your program, I'll drop out of the race. And Al Gore chose differently. Al Gore chose violence, as they say.
I don't, I think, again, that's a tactical question. I don't think there's an absolute answer to it for all places and all time. But right now, I don't think there's much to be gained by this idea of a third party.
What would Marx say? I mean, if you can imagine, as one of the foremost experts on Marx, if Marx were transmuted into the body of AOC or Rashida Tlaib or whatever, and we're operating in Congress right now, what do you think would be his strategic or rhetorical choice?
Well, first off, I dispute your characterization of me as a great expert on Marx. I just like Marx and I like Marx and all that kind of thing. And a lot of experts on Marx dislike intensely what I do. So, I don't know, I'm not an expert on Marx. I just find what Marx is doing is extremely revealing and helpful. And he has this dual kind of notion about capital. On one hand, capital brings you to this point of fantastic possibility. At the same time as it creates a world which is empty, meaningless, alienation. We've not really talked about that, and loss of meaning, and it's that duality which is what we live daily between the potentiality, all the things we have, all the household gadgets we have, all of the technological gadgets we have, some of which terrify me. But on one hand, but on the other hand, where's the meaning? And you're finding people clutching at meaning, which is where white supremacy comes from, where all these crazy kind of beliefs come from. People, I mean, we have to start to think about, creating a world in which meaning can be created in a constructive kind of way about a different kind of society and social order.
I'm gonna follow up. I'm gonna double down on this, though. Even if you don't see yourself as an expert on Marx,
I'm not an expert.
I'm curious what you imagine how Marx would meet this political moment, in particular if he were in a position of relative power, like one of the progressive members of Congress.
Well, it depends what year you asked him, because in 1858 he would say something very different from 1867, which was very different from what he'd say in 1844. He was always changing his mind about things. But I think one of the things he would do is to try to say, look, we need a coherent political organization. We need to create a party, if you want to call it that, or the infrastructure of a party, which is going to actually transform things. And this comes down to something which is really a complicated question, which is, to what degree would a left-wing party have to be authoritarian? Are you going to sit there and sort of say, happily coddle all those right-wingers who start yelling sort of fascistic slogans at your door, or are you going to round them up and put them in jail? I mean, it's kind of, this is a very big issue when you get close to power, and therefore there are limits to the democratization that can occur.
The argument made by, I argue, most on the left at this point is that there are a significant chunk, I think a significant majority even, of people who comprise Trump voters who, adopt or embrace or tolerate the kind of nationalist xenophobia and that aspect of Trumpism, because the core attraction, or at least a significant part of the attraction, is a kind of populism that has more energy, or at least in 2016, had more energy in Donald Trump than the Democratic Party candidate in Hillary Clinton. And that the same forces that made Trump so popular unexpectedly made Bernie Sanders so popular unexpectedly. And if there were a leftist to rise to political power in the presidency, that the issue wouldn't be so much needing to violently suppress those working class right-wing populists, even if they still have a certain degree of racial animus, just like, frankly, a lot of Democrats do. But the real issue is, to what extent are you going to need to use force to combat the counter-revolution that comes from the elites? And what kind of pressure are you going to get from the bourgeois class that is actually benefiting from the system as it is, and in which is very much empowered through the military and other kind of more privatized, the police state, to defend themselves and defend, quote unquote, property.
Yes. Well, I think that, you're going to have a left-wing organization that is going to have to confront the bourgeoisie. And so doing it has to do it in a way that is, rooted in its own experiential world. And one of the things you mentioned there is an interesting one. I spent some time in France in the 1970s, and that was a moment when quite a few people in the Communist Party, who'd been in the Communist Party for a long time, transferred their allegiance to Le Pen and the neo-fascist party. and it was a sort of working class movement, if you like, within the Communist Party. It was very difficult for the Communist Party. And of course, one of the big issues there was questions of national identity, immigration, and the like. And that sort of issue hasn't gone away. In fact, that has been very much heightened in our contemporary world, the anti-immigrant stuff. And it's no accident, it seems to me, that that's the thing that Biden is, the rest is sort of doing okay. At the popular level, the migration stuff, serious difficulty that he's running into. And I think that question is going to be one of the big questions of the coming years. But also it's connected very much to the issue of labor,
right,
where the labor question becomes crucial. And what people don't realize is in the 1960s, the German state subsidized the importation of Turkish labor. The French state subsidized the importation of Algerian and North African labor. The British drew upon the empire. The United States opened up its immigration laws in 1965 to the whole world. And this was a bourgeois capitalist requirement of wanting to have surplus labor. And so that was therefore, the whole immigration policy was around surplus labor and disempowering indigenous labor. And indigenous labor looked on that and knew that very well, which is why some indigenous labor in Europe moved to the far right, because they were anti-immigrant. So the whole kind of question of the migrant question is a really thorny one, which I think is going to be possibly an Achilles heel for the Biden administration.
Is it still the case today that there is a continued need for more surplus unskilled labor, or is it more the case that, well, we've kind of, through technology and efficiencies, like we've reached a tipping point?
Well, the surplus of unskilled labor is one thing, but as you know, Silicon Valley feeds off the surplus labor of highly educated people from Eastern Europe and from South Asia and all the rest of it. So that, the corporate requirement is strong there. And then the whole kind of question of, agricultural labor is very, very significant. And the fact that the border was blocked a little bit had created all kinds of problems for California agribusiness in terms of its harvesting and capacities and so on. So there's a lot of issues there. The labor issue is still foundational. Unfortunately, a lot of this has got turned into a cultural issue, which is not irrelevant, but we're not looking at the labor side of things very, very clearly. And what in effect has happened, and this is what is a bit scary about the situation, is you move from a situation where the disparities in wage rates around the world in, say, 1970 were very great. They've lessened since there's been a globalization of labor supply. And therefore, through the globalization of labor supply, that depresses labor rights, depresses labor remuneration throughout the whole capitalist world. And that is, of course, very much to the corporate benefit.
Well, it seems like the problem is fundamentally that this is not it's not a domestic issue. There's just no domestic issues anymore. It's not a thing that exists.
Right. No.
And the AOC, who's come out under a lot of heat this week, did an Instagram live last night where she made this point. And she said that, you're not going to solve what's going on at the border unless you are willing to address American foreign policy and unless you are willing to address labor policy, unless you're willing to address all of these issues. And so there are these gestures to the substantive critique, but it also feels like we can say that, but one, it stays on the fringe, and two, it still feels like, to your point, you called it a thorny issue. To even acknowledge, and I know there are myriad studies on this, and it's not so clear cut, but that there is any negative effect on indigenous labor from immigration is tantamount to saying something discriminatory about an ethnic group in the current discourse. right?
Yeah.
And that makes it very difficult to have a conversation about how to fix the problem in constructive ways that inure to the substantive benefit of human beings who would really prefer not to be leaving their home, right? But I wonder if having a better understanding of some of these labor dynamics, and maybe you can help us, I know that we're coming to the end of our time, but it can help us to be able to better have that conversation, have those conversations and move us forward without getting caught up in this wheel of a Democrat saying, we got to help kids in cages, and a Republican saying, but what about American steelworkers or whatever? And the Democrat saying, well, you're a racist. And then the Republican saying, you don't really care about kids in cages because Biden's still locking them up. And everyone's a little bit right.
Yeah,
and we go round and round and round.
Yeah. No, there's not an easy answer to this. And you're right to kind of say, well, this is the sort of situation where the global labor force is what we should be looking at. And one of the things that we have to understand is that the global wage labor force has expanded enormously since 1980. It's increased by about 1 billion wage workers. And what are they all working? And who are they in competition with? So one of the things that's happened with the relaxation of capital controls is that capital can flow around pretty much to wherever the labor force is now. And so you're getting this downward pressure to equalize the labor wage rates, which isn't, I'm not saying it's there, that the US workers are now being paid the same as sort of Filipino or Chinese workers. No, obviously not. But there is a tendency towards an equalization of the wage rate on a global basis. And you're right. You're not going to be able to do anything about that unless you have a global politics. And I have to say, I'm okay with some of the things that Biden's doing domestically. His foreign policy is horrible. It's really, really horrible. It's imperialist, and it's, doing all the negative things that you really don't want, saying negative things about what's going on in Bolivia and, so on. I mean, this is terrible. I don't like it at all.
Do you have a vision? Do you imagine? Do you fantasize about what it would look like to transition kind of into a post-capitalist society? I mean, you talk about how, we are so enmeshed. Our expectations are such in terms of what we are able to consume, the technology we use, all of that kind of thing. That would be difficult for us to pivot quickly. And you've also said that, some of these arguably reformist changes are useful insofar as they give us a foothold and broaden our expectations of what we can have. So what does the path forward look like? In an ideal world, where we make the best of this crisis, where do you see us going, and do you imagine us actually moving past capitalism?
See, I have certain things that I think are really critical this comes from my reading of Marx. Mm-hmm. Marx is very much about individual liberty and freedom. It's very much about that. But he's saying basically you can't have individual liberty and freedom unless there is a collective will to create the kind of society where individual freedom and individual will can be truly exercised. And we live in a society where that's not the case. So we have to have a collective movement to create the form of society which is going to maximize individual liberty and freedom. You then ask the question, well, what is your measure of individual liberty and freedom? And that's where this thing of free time comes in. If we could take care of our basic necessities by working sort of 1 day a week, we'd have 6 days a week to do what the hell we pleased.
Podcasts.
Whatever we wanted. We could go, play music, or we could go, roller skating. I do whatever we want. So Marx is kind of saying, well, that's what true individual liberty and freedom is, but it's going to take collective action to do it. The paradox here is that those people who believe in the natural right of individual liberty and freedom, which is the bourgeois conception, deny the solidarity that will allow the construction of society which will give you true individual liberty and freedom. So my fantasy is we will collectively recognize that we need collectively to establish ways of being and ways of producing and ways of distributing, which are going to maximize individual liberty and freedom for everyone, not just for the bourgeois who can sit on their yachts off Bahamas and ride out a coronavirus epidemic that way. No, No, this is what we're looking at, and we're looking at the decommodification, but not a society which is all sort of homogeneous. We're looking at one which is full of diversity. Diversity is one of the greatest strengths that human beings have, and to enjoy the diversity is one of the reasons I love living in metropolitan areas, is because of the diversity. And one of the things I'm missing by being on lockdown is missing the diversity. So I have this fantasy, yes, and I think that fantasy is very, very important to have in your mind. And the reason, I just don't think the collectivity is good for the sake of it being good. And of course, the right-wing view of Marx is all about collectivity, and you subsume yourself inside the collectivity, and that's it. No. You create the collectivity in order to create individual liberty. And when you turn to people right now and say, how much individual liberty do you really have? The answer is not very much, particularly when you say, how much free time do you have? And you find right now people are saying, I have no free time at all. I mean, and you kind of go, well, wouldn't you like to live in a society where you had sufficient food and housing and all the rest of it to have a decent life and lots of free time? Would you like that? We have to have those visions, it seems to me, as to what socialism might be all about.
Taking us out, I just had one last question, which is, we often get requests from our audience to recommend things to read. And I'm curious, do you have any recommendations? What should our audience read, and what would you like for them to take away?
I think that's difficult to say. I mean, I of course I write books, and so I'm bound to say, well, you should read.
They can be your books, yeah.
Okay. Well, I think The Enigma of Capital, for example, is a good place to start. The last one I did on Marx, Capital and the Madness of Economic Reason, is a bit more advanced, I think, but. Yeah,
what should newbies like myself, 35-year-olds who are just getting hip to Marx, what should we read?
Well, again, it depends upon how much time, and by the way, it's very important in these things to do it collectively. As you know, I have a Marx course online, and I get a lot of feedback from it. It says, we sat down as a group of 10 of us, and we decided to go through Capital using your online course, and it was great. And in fact, we started with 10 and we ended with 7, but that was, but nevertheless, 7 of us got through it, and we had a great time doing it. So if you feel like, that sort of effort, on the other hand, a lighter touch or some of the other texts which are around, I really do encourage people to go back to the originals and make of it what they will. I don't have I have my particular things I take from Marx, but I don't expect anybody to agree with me. In fact, plenty of people don't, and that's okay. But it's very revelatory to spend some time with the Marx text.
All right, you heard it here, folks. You got to go back to the source material.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, don't believe me, believe Marx. I mean,
I'm sure a lot of people will be interested in your seminar. Where can they find you?
It's on the YouTube website. And I have a davidharvey.org, which has all of my lectures and all of my online classes. You can do volume 1 of Capital, you can do volume 2 and some of volume 3, and you can do the Grundrisse online. So there's a lot of online materials if people want to follow up on it. And of course, the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles was the podcast and the book that came from the podcast. Sometimes that's a good entry because it's all over the place, and it mentions, all kinds of things from a Marxist perspective.
As I mentioned up top, you can find the reading the lecture course on Capital in podcast form, which I've been enjoying because you can multitask and walk through the beautiful spring days we've been having and or clean your apartment while getting some good book learning. So thank you so much, Professor Harvey. I hope to have you back and for you to help us weed through some of these difficult issues as they can continue to present themselves. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. That would be great. I'd really enjoy it. Yes. Thank you.